Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the December Core Advocate webinar, Reading Instruction with the End in Mind. We're so glad to have you join us this evening. While we're waiting for just a minute for everyone to get signed on, be sure to use the resources widget to download handouts from tonight's webinar, and we will get started in just a minute. Great, so let's go ahead and begin our webinar this evening. Your hosts for tonight's webinar include me, Jenny Beltramini, and my colleague Nicole Bravo from the Professional Learning Team at Student Achievement Partners. And we're also lucky to have Student Achievement Partners Senior Literacy Specialist Carrie Swanson as our guest presenter this evening. So in case you're not familiar with our Core Advocate Network, Core Advocates are educators from all over the country who believe in the potential of high quality standards and the importance of all students being prepared for college and careers. They support their colleagues in understanding and advocating for the standards and embrace the shifts in instruction. The Core Advocate Network is over 13,000 educators strong, and we'd love for you to join us if you have not done so already. If you'd like to learn more about the network, you can contact me, Jenny Beltramini. My email is listed on the screen. And we also want to invite you to join the network by signing up at achievethecore.org/CA-signup. And you can visit our website also for more information on the Core Advocate Network and opportunities. So we're going to take a minute and do a quick poll. We are wondering to get to know who is with us a little bit more this evening. How many Core Advocate webinars have you attended? So if you'd take a minute and submit your answer. Great. So we will look at the results in just a minute of the poll, but while we're waiting for the results, we encourage you to engage with us tonight during tonight's webinar on Twitter, and you can continue the conversation also after the webinar on Twitter. So during the webinar, you can actually use the Twitter widget that is available on your screen. Be sure to use the hashtag Core Advocates so you can see your tweets stream live right on your screen. And our poll results, it looks like most of you, actually almost 80% of you, this is your first Core Advocate webinar. So welcome to all of our new attendees. We're so happy to have you, and we hope that you learn a lot and enjoy the webinar experience and join us for another webinar in the future. And it looks like we've got somebody who is a seasoned Core Advocate webinar attendee, has attended 16 or more. And a few others of you have attended between 2 and 5 and 6 to 10 webinars. So welcome to everybody. We're glad to have you with us this evening. So one more, actually several more ways for you to join, to engage with us on tonight's webinar. We're going to use the Q&A widget in order for you to ask us questions. So we'll monitor your questions as closely as possible throughout the webinar and answer as many of them as we can. And if we don't get to your questions, they'll be saved so we can respond to them afterwards. Also, I already mentioned that the resources widget is where you'll find handouts and links to resources from the webinar tonight. And we're also trying out a group chat widget tonight for a way for participants to engage with one another during the webinar. So you'll be able to see what one another types in there and be able to chat with one another. Also, once the webinar is completed, you'll get access to the recorded webinar. So the recording, as well as all the handouts, slides and materials will be loaded onto Achieve the Core, and the webinar will also be available from this platform On24 for on-demand viewing. Additionally, if you download the slide deck from Achieve the Core, all of the hyperlinks in the presentation will be live, so you'll be able to click on them to get to those places on the web. So the goals for our webinar tonight are to determine research-based best practices for small group instruction in literacy, identify options for small group instruction that are alternatives to traditional leveled reading groups, and understand how and why to use complex text with all students in your reading or literacy instruction. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our expert presenter tonight, Carrie Swanson. Welcome, Carrie. We're so glad to have you, and I'd love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself to our webinar guests.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm really excited about both the turnout and the fact that so many of you are engaging with Student Achievement Partners for the first time through this webinar. I'll actually be referencing quite a few resources, so hopefully you'll get a chance to not only dig into the topic of this webinar, but some other resources that we have on Achieve the Core. As Jenny mentioned, I'm a senior literacy specialist on the advisory team with Student Achievement Partners. I've been doing that work for about 2.5 years, and prior to that, I was a school leader and a teacher in New York City and worked with grades K through 8. I spent an awful lot of time in my career doing traditional leveled reading instruction, as I'm assuming many of you do as well, and have really had some amazing insights and an opportunity to learn deeply about the research and research-based best practices for reading. And so I'm excited about tonight's content as a chance to confront a few misconceptions that are out there and really think about how to be as impactful as possible as we're planning literacy instruction for all students. So we're going to start off by looking a little bit at what research says. So our first section is really digging into research. And as we are considering the research, I just wanted a little bit of a sense of who's out there. So another quick poll for you. If you're a teacher, you can talk about your school or your district. If you're not a teacher, you can think about the educators that you work with or interact with most frequently. And I just want a sense of whether your experience is that you or those educators you work with use reading levels for guided reading instruction always, often, rarely, or never. So just considering your own experience. Give you a second to click on that poll. And as our poll data is loading up, it did load already. I figured that we would have a lot of folks who, and it looks like we do, a lot of folks who have a lot of experience with using reading levels for guided reading. I was recently asked by someone who has been doing a lot of education work who wasn't a teacher to identify when I first was exposed to the idea of traditional guided reading, and I couldn't actually think of when or how that idea came into my consciousness. Quite simply, it was always just an assumption of what you did to reach your students is to divide them up into groups based on their reading level. So I had a lot of different professional development experiences and reading over my career as an educator, but I couldn't actually think of a time when I didn't kind of know about this idea or use this idea. So it's really interesting to see how prevalent it is in the field, because what we actually see in reading research is that there's not a lot of support. In fact, there's a lack of support for the concept of leveled reading instruction. So students are, in practice, often placed into small group instruction, but research doesn't actually support that practice. On the screen is an excerpt from one of Tim Shanahan's blogs, and if you're not familiar with Tim Shanahan, he's a reading researcher, and his blog is excellent, Translating Research to Practice. So I highly recommend it. It's Shanahan on Literacy, and you have a copy of the full blog in your resource widget. But here we see this idea that kids that were taught from grade level materials do as well as those who are taught at an instructional level, or the instructional level placements have actually led to less learning. So this is a very common practice, but not one that research supports across all grades. In fact, the only place we can find some evidence for this as a most effective practice in reading research is in the earliest grades in K and 1. And at the same time, as I said, the folks on this webinar are very used to leveled reading instruction, and in fact, the teachers across the country are showing that same finding. The Fordham Institute very recently, in spring of 2018, did a large report called Reading and Writing Instruction in America's Schools, and this was based on teacher survey data. So teachers were surveyed on elements of their reading and writing practice. And what they found was even more teachers now in 2018 are selecting text for their students based on reading level than grade level text, even more now than in 2010. So since the rollout of Common Core standards, yet still even more teachers are leveling their students and selecting text based on levels. And they also are pointing to the fact that research suggests that teachers can't pinpoint student reading levels very precisely. So it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint that precise level. And even if they could, giving them a steady diet of easy text doesn't support learning effectively. So just more data behind how challenging this can be. And what the Fordham report also does is points to this idea that it's not enough to simply respond by giving students more challenging text. But if we want teachers to be assigning grade level text rather than reading level text, we really need to help bridge the gap between the two. So that's what we'll go into tonight. And the final piece of research or data for you to consider comes from this article, Are Classroom Reading Groups the Best Way to Teach Reading? Maybe Not. This was an article in EdWeek that was summarizing a study. And this study was really focusing on leveled reading instruction over time. So often in our classroom experience, we're really thinking about the duration of time from September to June or from August to May, the time that students are in our classroom. And it's hard to think about the impact of this practice over the course of their instruction in many years in school. But this study followed 12,000 kindergarten through third grade students, and what they were looking at was guided reading group placement and reading performance. And they found that the students who were placed in the lowest groups in kindergarten quite honestly never caught up to those students placed in the highest group. So we're doing this practice presumably trying to meet students where they are, because that's something that we've been trained to do, to meet students where they are, and yet we're not catching them up. So it really means we're meeting them where they are and we are staying there. Those kids are staying at the levels that they're being assigned from the earliest experiences in school, which is a pretty staggering thought. So we want to flip this script a bit, and we want to think about what it means to actually not just meet students where they are, but think about the end, think about where they're going. And to think about that, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story from my classroom, a little bit of true confessions. When I spent several years as a fourth grade teacher. I taught up to eighth grade as well. And when I was teaching fourth grade, I taught in the kindergarten through eighth grade school, so that those grade levels span. So when I was teaching fourth grade, for a time we had an interim assessment in our school that would generate data reports. And so my students were marked on that data with red squares, yellow triangles, and green dots. And I had a love of young adult novels. I still have a love of young adult novels. And I would justify that reading habit by saying that I was reading to recommend books to my students for their independent reading or for small group instruction. But really, the books that I would be reading would be a bit complex for my fourth grade class. And what I did is I formed a book club with those green dot readers. So we read amazing literature that I loved and they loved. And I was so excited to share great books with them. And I wasn't cognizant of what I was actually doing in the classroom in terms of supporting the students who already were proficient in reading with rich, fabulous literature and a joy of reading, and not actually offering that experience to all my students. So I was really perpetuating a very inequitable reading practice, offering amazing experiences to kids who I hadn't taught to read. They already knew how to read, as was evidenced by their data. And I am asking us tonight to really think about what it takes to change that narrative. So instead of every single child reading the text that is at their level and separating kids based on their level, what will happen in the classroom if every student reads the same grade level text, and if what is varied is the teacher support. So also from the Fordham report here, the idea that teacher support and explanation, not text difficulty, is what should be differentiated. Otherwise, struggling readers may never catch up. We are not saying that giving challenging text to students is the move. Supporting their access to those texts are the moves, the many moves of the teacher, and it is absolutely challenging work. There's no question, but really rewarding work if you can think about the impact it can have on your students. So we talk about this gap, this achievement gap, or this opportunity gap a lot in education. And the researcher, Stanovich, coined the phrase the Matthew effect to explain this. If you haven't heard of the Matthew effect before just now, I highly encourage you to Google Matthew Effect Washington Core Advocates. They're a group who made a 90-second video that explains it beautifully. But the idea is really that when our kids come in the doors in kindergarten at age 5, there's already some difference in terms of students who are ready to read, students who have already been exposed to the code, and students who haven't. And as that continues with each year that they're in school, students who crack the code quickly are exposed to more complex text, more complicated syntax, more interesting vocabulary and concepts much more rapidly than other students in the same grade who haven't cracked that code. And over time, this Matthew effect phrase, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer when it comes to words. And this means that as students are in school with us, the more years they're in our classroom, the wider, or our classrooms, the wider that gap gets, which is really staggering. And I think we can point a picture to why that happens when we look at our instructional materials. So on the screen here, you have a sample of vocabulary words that were found in 5th grade leveled readers. This came from a Basel program. So the idea is that if you don't have a Basel, a textbook reader, those are often set up so that there are below level, on level, and above level texts for each week, for each week's lesson. And students are given those texts based on their level. It's clear from these words that there's something about earthquakes that's consistent in each of these texts, but you can see the vocabulary difference between the below level students and what they're exposed to, the on level students, and then those above level readers. I'm going to pause so you can take in those words for a second. And right here, what we see is every week, those above level students in particular, and even the on level students, are getting more exposure to rich, complex tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, and the below level students aren't. And this has so many effects, because you can also think about the confidence that those higher readers are acquiring and just the way that they're perceived and how teachers interact with them. Think about how you might interact with a 5th grader who uses the words galvanized or languished in their writing, and how you might perceive them as a successful scholar when they've gotten this exposure that their below level peers have not gotten. So we think of complex text as an imperative of college and career ready standards, but we also think of complex text as a tool for equity. So the idea of having all students in complex text is helping to equalize instruction and exposure and access. If you haven't gotten a chance to check out your resource widget yet, I'd encourage you to do this now, because there's quite a few resources there for you tonight. The copies of the readings are for you all to have access to the readings that I've been mentioning throughout the webinar. There's also a copy of a text complexity rubric, one for literacy, one for literary text, and one for informational text. And those rubrics were actually developed to be a tool for use of complex text for teachers. So the idea is that once a text is given a Lexile number, which gives you some information about its complexity, you then have to think qualitatively about what makes that text complex. We're going to use the rubrics for literary text tonight just a little bit, and that's one of those resources that you have. And if you're interested in more resources to support this work on Achieve the Core, there is a suite of tools around text complexity that can be beneficial for you. The rubrics divide up the possible complexity that might exist in a text into categories, into 4 sort of quadrants. So there's the meaning or the purpose of the text that might make that text complex. There's the way the text is structured, whether it's simple, whether it's chronological, or whether there's some variation there. There's the language, so whether it's literal and clear or figurative and ambiguous, whether there might be archaic language versus conversational vocabulary. And then there's the knowledge, not the knowledge of your students, but the knowledge that the author expects you to have to access that text. So if you are reading an advanced chemistry text, it's going to have very complex knowledge demands because the expectation is that you already have a baseline understanding. So those are the categories, and text might be complex in all of these ways, or they might be more complex in 1 or 2. Knowing this and using this can help us think about how we support students' access. If we know what's most challenging about the text, we can think about where students might need a good question, a good prompt, or a good support in order to access it. So I want to pause and give you a chance to interact with some of this content. So in the chat box, I'd love to see some reflections on either how you see the Matthew effect playing out in your own school, so how you see this gap growing, or instructional practices that can either contribute to or mitigate the effects of the opportunity gap. So any reflections that you all have right now as you think about the Matthew effect and how it may or may not play out in your own work.
Great, thank you. Carrie, I'll just share out a few things that I'm seeing, and feel free, I know it might be a little confusing with a Q&A and a group chat widget, but if you all type in the group chat, not only Carrie and Nicole and I can see, but everybody else on the webinar can see, and if you have a question just for us, you can use the Q&A. But a couple things that I've seen is somebody mentioned that with this approach, more students are actively engaged in discussion and discourse and critical thinking about the text. And so that was one positive that somebody noticed. Also, several people are mentioning different scaffolds that they use in order to help all students access the complex text, maybe front loading a little bit for certain students. Having other ways to scaffold so that all students can access the complex text. So there's been lots of great comments in the chat. Thank you all for participating, and we'll continue to read them, and you can all see them as well, and we'll answer questions also.
Thanks, Jenny. It's hard sometimes for me when I think about practices that I engaged in that might not have been as effective as I meant them to be. So one of the things I want to make sure to stress is that I truly believe that this comes from very well-intentioned educators trying to support their students. So that is, of course, the goal we all have, thinking about how to support our students. But I saw a couple of reflections of practices that might actually be teachers doing the work. So teachers front-loading what's hard about a text before the kids engage, teachers preparing PowerPoints or presentations that can kind of serve as shorthand for the text rather than letting kids grapple a little bit and struggle for themselves. So it's really nice to see those reflections and think about how you can learn and improve your practice as a result. So with that in mind, we're going to go into kind of then what. So we really try at Student Achievement Partners to be action-oriented for teachers and to not just expose you to reading research or to research-based best practices, but think about tangible actions that teachers can take as a result. The blog post that has the same name as this webinar, Reading Instruction with the End in Mind, has this sort of process that's on the screen, this visual set of steps right here around addressing student needs while working with grade level text. And what we're going to do is actually engage with this process a bit. So the first step is thinking about using student data, both formal or informal data, to think about where a student's reading proficiency is, and then use the text itself to think about their strengths and their needs and how that student's strengths and needs might interact with the expectations of a grade level text. From there, looking at the areas of growth of what the student might need, what's preventing them from potentially accessing the text easily, and creating an intervention or support strategy for that student, and continuing to reassess their progress. So this is similar to what we might do with traditional guided reading, but it's actually thinking about support students need in order to access complex text. We're going to try that process out right now. So we're going to think like a teacher about the needs of the classroom, thinking because this is a kind of range of educators K through 12 on the line, we're going to root ourselves in middle elementary as a place to kind of practice this work. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take a look at the text that's in your resource widget, which is an excerpt from Because of Winn-Dixie. It's the first couple of pages from the chapter. And I'd like you to read that to yourself. And as you're reading, think, what is complex about this text? So for a third grade class, this is in the appropriate grade level complexity band. So what about this text actually makes it complex? If you would like to use the rubrics for that, you can, or you can kind of jot to yourself or think about what, as you read, what seems like a complication of the text. And as you're reading, just note in the chat what you think is complex about this excerpt.
So some of the things, Carrie, that people are mentioning are some language features might make this text complex, and also some life experiences, some of the knowledge that might be required to understand the text. Somebody also mentioned the sentence structure, the grammatical structure, and even syntax are other things that people have mentioned.
Thank you. So I will actually say the one thing I want to clarify is that when we're thinking about what makes the text complex, we're not thinking about our students yet. We think about our students when we think about their tasks. So I would say that the author is not necessarily presenting knowledge in a way that's not explained, but the complexity that I looked at, and this is a really great exercise to do with colleagues in professional learning communities or team meetings or lesson planning, because you can find a lot to dig into when you're thinking about text complexity. I looked a little bit at what I found was in the meaning category, thinking about what Opal's actually doing, and identifying the fact. Opal is the narrator. If you're not familiar with the story, she's only referred to as I in this excerpt. But identifying the fact that she actually is not the owner of this dog, that she's making it up as she goes, that is not explained by the author. There's dialogue there and there's action there, and there's not that level of explanation. So students or readers might miss that. So I'm sorry, I just clicked through. But in these paragraphs that I pulled out from the text, there are a couple of places that I might design a question or task or revisit, have students reread, so that they notice that it does say at first I didn't see a dog. And then it says, wait a minute, I hollered, that's my dog. So the author doesn't explain that part. We're making an inference. We know that there's some more complicated meaning there, that this character has decided to pretend that it's her dog. And even later in this third excerpt that's up here, it said, I didn't know what his name is, so I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, here, Winn-Dixie. These are portions of the text that students might miss, and we may need to think about how to draw their attention to these portions of the text. So I've really done that step of reading my text, thinking about the text itself, and now I'm going to think about the students. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to look at two students, sort of prototypes for this kind of work. And I know that in the classroom you'd have many more than two, so I want to clarify that this isn't meant to imply that you need to make an individual plan for every child. You can think about your readers and kind of their categories of need. Many children have some similar needs that you can group together. So as we were talking about reading instruction, rethinking levels, thinking about small group instruction, and how students might be grouped based on the needs that they have. So we have this mock student here, James. And James's profile is that he is scoring below basic on the district-wide interim assessment. So in my story of how my data sheets worked in my fourth grade class, James would be a red triangle, right? He's getting low scores on these reading assessments. So to find out more information, his teacher had him read orally from grade level fluency passages that are on Achieve the Core. And just so you know, that's a real resource for you. We have for second grade and above fluency passages that you can listen to students' oral reading and also ask questions about the text. And in doing so, his teacher found that fluency and decoding were not a barrier. So he's a fluent reader, he can decode. But the teacher also found that James had trouble answering more nuanced questions that required him to provide text evidence. So his sort of below basic score is something about his ability to catch those complexities as he reads or understand the questions as they're being asked and provide that detail. So we'll think about him and this text and what's next for James. And then I also want you to consider Stella, because we know we have a huge range of students in our classrooms. So Stella was a little bit higher performing. She scored low basic. She might be, yellow on that data sheet. And when her teacher tried to get more information, had her do an oral read of fluency passages, actually the teacher found that while her accuracy was okay, she was really a word-by-word decoder. So her decoding was laboriously slow. And her prosody, her expression, really didn't show understanding of the text. So she was reading through punctuation and reading really slowly. And even looking back at the data, the teacher found that she had not finished a huge portion of the test. So definitely some slow reading rate and decoding problems for Stella. So we now have another resource for you. And this resource is a strategy sheet. It's called Strategies for Supporting Struggling Readers with Grade Level Text. And you'll notice that the strategy sheet is what I would call a comprehensive but not exhaustive list of options. You all might think of strategies that aren't on this list that would be great, and I encourage you to share those. But it is set up to think about strategies you can use before reading, during that first read, during rereads, subsequent reads, or after or between readings in order to support students. So your next task here, as you're thinking like a teacher, is to take a look at some of those strategies and think about James and Stella's profile. They're both on the screen for your reference. Take a look at the strategies and those student profiles and see if you can identify, as you think about the demands of this particular text, a scaffold or a couple of scaffolds that you might use to support James or to support Stella. So what might you do with this text to support the needs of the students in your room? And you can chat those in your chat box. Jenny, I'm going to use good wait time here because I know there's a lot of juggling folks are doing. So let's give just a couple minutes for folks to be able to enter their answers before we share any.
Great, thanks, Carrie.
Want to start to share a few?
Yes, there are some great answers. It's hard to actually keep up with everything that people are typing, but I saw many references for Stella about different ways to give her repeated opportunities with the text, repeated readings, maybe an audio recording, the book on tape type of a scaffold. Some people mentioned buddy reading for Stella. So lots of ways for her to hear the text while she's following along and looking at the words on the page. And then I've also seen several strategies for James. Many are mentioning chunking the text. He's not keeping track of his comprehension, and so reading small chunks and then thinking back about what he's read, maybe rereading certain parts to keep track of what is happening, and to be able to go back and check on his comprehension. Great
ideas. Yeah, so Stella needs a fluent model, right? And so that's really important for Stella. So having some sort of audio support, having a buddy read with a second read. And for students second grade and above, that looks like following along in the text while someone is reading with them, or choral reading, echo reading, a chance for them to be following that complex text, but also hearing proficient reading so they can be building their fluency. And James needs some support. He is not making as much meaning while he reads, and so he might need some chunking, like you said, or he might need some targeted questions around those sections of the text we were looking at that kind of reveal what Opal is doing but don't explain, so that he can know where to look on that text, right? He can have some support there. So lots of things that you can be doing to support these readers. And what's great about this work is Stella and James are not likely the only students with similar needs. And so you can start to think about where would it be helpful in a small group for Stella to have a preview for kids like Stella to get a chance to hear the text ahead of time before moving into a lesson? Or would it be helpful to do some responses with students like James that allow them to reread? So lots of ways you can vary the support to get to their needs. So the idea here is every single child needs some consistent opportunities to work with grade level text, but to accomplish that, it's our supports that we vary. And we think about whether those supports are best for the whole class or whether they are supports that need to be administered a little more individually. I saw a couple of questions that I realized I should have probably put at the beginning of this webinar, so I apologize, but I saw some questions around kindergarten and first grade in particular in this work. So I just wanted to clarify that when we're talking about complex text with kindergarten and first grade, we're really talking about the teacher read aloud. And with second grade, we're talking about a little bit of a mix. Those text complexity requirements, they come into play with second and third grade. Kindergarten and first grade are not going to be reading text themselves as they're emergent readers. They're not going to read the text themselves, but are offering the rich vocabulary and the rich sort of content. They are going to be listening to those texts. And so lots of kids might have needs like James, but we wouldn't be worrying about profiles like Stella yet, because we wouldn't expect them to be fluent in texts that were so far above their grade level expectations. We recommend for the read aloud in kindergarten and first grade that you read aloud 2 to 3 grade levels ahead of where your class is. So you're reading to kindergarten with texts that really fall into that second grade or third grade band, so that you're exposing them to that rich content that they can access through the teacher. So thank you for asking those questions, so we can make sure that that part is clarified. And then I have a disclaimer here, especially as we're thinking about older students who might be struggling readers and the different gaps that they might have. And that's that we are not saying that kids are only reading grade level complex text. We are not saying that. I have a lot to learn about, let's say, if I wanted to learn more about my example earlier on advanced chemistry, I'd have a lot to learn. And if someone told me I could only read advanced chemistry texts for my reading life, I would shut down, and I would absolutely not want to do that. We're saying complex texts shouldn't be, students shouldn't be deprived of them. Every single child needs to have exposure, and some students might need more support for that exposure to be meaningful. So close reading of complex text is vital, but it's not enough on its own. It's necessary but not sufficient. When we're talking about close reading, we're talking about grade level text, fewer pages, more support, and an instructional purpose. So that's where the teacher is asking those questions, directing you to reread, using those scaffolds. When we're talking about a volume of reading, that can be a huge range. Students might be reading text based just on their interest. They might be reading text in small groups. They might be given more pages but lighter support, and that can be a huge range. So it's not that there's no place for reading texts that are below the grade level. It's that there's no place for preventing students from having that rich access. Another thing that I wanted to point to here is just the role of knowledge and vocabulary, and how important it is to understand that the more students know about content, the better they're able to access that content. I always explain this as if you think about, as a teacher, your dinosaur kids, those kids that regardless of how well they read or how well they perform on assessments, they can absolutely read anything about dinosaurs because they're so interested in that content and that topic. So sometimes you're preparing students to read something that's complex, because of really sophisticated vocabulary or because of the knowledge of the topic that the text requires. So in this example, the teacher is perhaps having students read about amphibian life cycles and notices that there's a lot of Tier 2 and Tier 3 language that might present challenges. You can really use other texts themselves on the same topic as a scaffold. So you can actually think about building that content knowledge through text sets on a topic. And we also have a lot of resources for this on Achieve the Core. So we have example text sets, and some publishers have really switched to making text sets a priority. Text sets are simply a set of resources on a topic, often starting with simpler resources and moving to more complex ones, so that the access to the challenging text is actually supported by reading on that topic over time. And what's really exciting about text sets is the fact that they actually support and accelerate vocabulary growth. They're also a best practice for supporting English language learners. So if you've heard about the role of content or the idea of language and literacy and learning as supporting English language learners, texts that are connected on a topic can be really supportive because you build understanding as you read and you build familiarity with the topic. And in fact, a study by Landauer and Demise back in 1997 found that you actually can acquire up to 4 times the vocabulary or acquire vocabulary 4 times faster by reading connected texts that share a topic. So that's really powerful, and there are a lot more resources on that on our text set project on Achieve the Core, but really a really important and exciting way of interacting with text and having the topic serve as a scaffold, knowledge of the topic itself serve as a scaffold. And then my final note this morning as you're thinking about this is this work, as you're thinking about especially the role of an intervention and support plan, this work in this webinar tonight was really focusing on thinking about helping students access complex text, this reading instruction with the end in mind, and what that does for our learners. But additional supports obviously might be needed at other times of the day to support unfinished learning. So for students like Stella who have a decoding gap or a fluency concern, the complex text is not going to necessarily alone support that need or that gap. This is another both and. This is a time where there's likely some support that has to be in addition to this work. It's just that it's not in place of. All of this is really couched in the idea that we are, of course, acknowledging our students and their individual needs, that we are meeting them where they are, but we're not staying there. We're thinking about what it means to meet them where they are going and the work that we need to do to support their ability to get there.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Great.
Yeah, such great information. We've had so much great dialogue in the group chat and really great questions. If anybody, there's been a few questions that Nicole and I have flagged that have already come up throughout the webinar, and I'll start by asking you one of them. But if anybody else has additional questions for Carrie, feel free to use the Q&A widget to go ahead and ask a question, and Nicole and I will monitor them. And we have a few minutes for Carrie to answer questions. So, Carrie, I'm going to start with a question that we got from a Nevada Core advocate. How do you address the strong belief of leveling with teachers in your schools? Do you have any suggestions on how we can address that with our colleagues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm doing that right now. Perhaps some of you are having a little bit of the discomfort that comes from wondering about a practice that has been a strong practice that you've immersed yourself in. I will say that Fountas and Pinnell themselves, the kind of leveling, big names behind leveling systems, have actually started to message some of this work as well. They have a blog post called "A Level is a Teacher's Tool, Not a Student's Label." If you follow them on Twitter, there have been some Twitter chats about setting up your library by topic rather than by level. And a lot of what they've said is that this was never The system was never intended to prevent access, but to support teachers in understanding and knowing more about their reader. So it has been misapplied in a lot of our schools. I think that can be really helpful for folks who prescribe DeFontis and Pinnell based practices to actually say, hey, these have been misapplied, misused. And the other thing is to really dig in and look at research. Educators are notoriously good at looking at anecdotal evidence and actually saying that that means that something works or doesn't work. And it's really important to realize that research is carefully conducted to think about what can work across sectors, across groups. And we want our teachers to be as well armed as our doctors to actually get to learn from that research and adjust their practices to match what they're finding in those fields. So really important for us to learn from reading science. So you can find a lot of readings even in your resource widget, but we can also share some more if folks feel like that would be valuable.
Great, thanks so much. And Nicole put the link to the Fontes and Pinnell article in the group chat so people can find it.
Oh, perfect.
Carrie, yeah, another question is, do you still recommend that guided reading groups stay at an instructional level?
Yeah, so it's interesting because this idea that, you find out at the independent level and then you instruct at the instructional level and you never go to frustrational. So that is the Tim Shanahan blog post. There is not evidence for that. There is not research that supports that. I think there are times when texts are too frustrational to be joyful or get a lot of learning. It happens to me if I try to read something that I'm not well prepared for. And so that's where I would use a text-set approach, try to build students' knowledge and understanding first. But I think the other thing to think about is students who have a lot of knowledge about the topic can probably read at a much higher level than they might be assessed at. And students who don't have a lot of knowledge about a topic might struggle immensely. It's why sometimes kids have a harder time with nonfiction than fiction, as if the nonfiction content's really unfamiliar to them. So I think we can be more flexible at how we think about that and really think more about the needs of the students and how we're supporting their access to grade level text and less about what will happen if we use an I instead of an H.
Great, thank you, Carrie. There were a couple of questions, I think that they came in before you sort of answered this, but I thought maybe if there was anything else you wanted to say, a question around what do you think about emerging readers with what you've said? And then somebody else asked about language learners. And so I thought maybe you could comment on either of those two things or both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for emerging readers first, kindergarten and first grade in particular, and often into second, those guys are still learning to decode. We want to make sure their decoding is accurate, that they have automaticity, and then eventually they move to rates. And we actually, we do that through systematic phonics and through a chance to read connected texts that give them practice. And we want to make sure that those guys get a real range of types of text at their fingertips. So I am less concerned about what they're reading in small group instruction. I think students who aren't making progress in phonics definitely need time to interact with decodable readers or a chance to practice the phonemic awareness or phonological awareness or phonics needs in small group instruction. Students who are at grade level can be doing a range of things with text. Variety is important for those kids, but we're really thinking about complex text happening through the read aloud there. And for English language learners, this is absolutely a case where what is a good for everyone practice is a best practice for English language learners. There is a lot of, again, well-intentioned kind of educator practice out there to keep students in tier 1 language and really working on their oral vocabulary before we give them text complexity. And what that does is it prevents them from getting a chance to learn the syntax and vocabulary that only comes from academic discourse. So for them to be able to read complex texts and have that topic support where you're getting to know more and more about sea mammals with each read, so you start to get some vocabulary. Not only are you talking about dolphins and blowholes, but you're talking about the surface, and you're talking about, what it is to be a mammal. That can be a huge support for building vocabulary. And just a quick plug for Lily Wong Fillmore's work here on juicy sentences. That is an English language learner's routine where what she does at all grades, you can Google this and you can see it at kindergarten, a beautiful, beautiful exercise here. But what she does for all grades is actually talk about isolating one amazing, rich sentence that can only be found in a complex text, and supporting students in deeply understanding and eventually sort of mimicking that sentence, that syntax, the vocabulary, the structure of the sentence in order to enrich their language development. So definitely best practices to support your English language learners.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. I think we're going to spend the last 5 minutes wrapping up our webinar, but hopefully most of you got your questions answered. And we have a record of the questions, so if we see one that needs to be addressed, we'll go ahead and reach out to you for sure. And I would just encourage you to check out other resources on the Achieve the Core. We have many other, with several other Core Advocate webinars archived on Achieve the Core around the topic of reading instruction that supports all students and accessing grade level text. And we also have quite a few aligned blog posts on our aligned blog around this topic as well, some of them in which Carrie has helped to author. So feel free to check those out in addition to continue your learning, in addition to the webinar tonight. If you found tonight's webinar helpful, we'd like to invite you to join our Core Advocate Network. I know I already talked about that at the beginning of our webinar tonight, but we want you to know we're committed to solving real problems that real teachers have, and we know the best way to do this is to know more about what folks are experiencing. So as part of our network, you have opportunities to connect with educators across the country and maybe even the Core Advocate Network in your state. You can keep up to date on our tools and resources that are available on Achieve the Core, as well as a variety of virtual learning opportunities like this one and other ways to engage with us. We also work with educators in our network to help us build our tools and resources. And so we'd love to learn about who you are, where you work, and the types of things you're interested in, and the expertise you already have. This way we'll be able to tailor our webinars and other opportunities to your needs and interests, and we may even tap you to be a panelist on one of our next webinars. We encourage you to join the network by filling out the survey at achievethecore.org/BA signup, but also continue to engage with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Pinterest. And we hope, if you found tonight's webinar useful, we hope you'll join us for next month's webinar, which is around foundational skills instruction in action. So we'll dig a little bit more deeply into our kindergarten, first and second grade readers. And we'll even be introducing you to our newly released foundational skills observation tool. It's going to be on Wednesday, January 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And the link is here to register for it. And if you download the slides after this webinar, you'll be able to just click right on that link. So thank you so much for everybody for joining us. We had a huge crowd tonight on the webinar and really awesome interaction in the group chat and on Twitter. So we hope you found it useful, and thank you, Carrie, for joining us. And we wish you a good evening tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.